Good day, everyone. Today's mini lecture is Organization Transformation and Change, and this is for session 4.1. Um, sorry. A few sessions ago, we discussed the difference between organizational development and organizational transformation. And we said before that transformation is something that's very difficult to plan, as evidenced here in this the slide. And usually transformation is very dramatic. So it encompasses the entire organization, and basically the reason why we're transforming is because of something happening from the outside, and it's forcing our organization to change. As said, transformation involves a systemic and a revolutionary change. So revolution generally is a very sudden and very dramatic change, as opposed to evolution, which usually occurs over a number of years. So transformation involves reshaping the company's or the organization's culture and its design elements. It's generally quite rapid and often involves integrated change to the entire organization. It's transformational because the majority of employees must change their behavior. So as opposed to organizational development, which usually just means a particular unit or department needs to change, here we're talking about the entire organization. So it involves basically the way we work together in an organization and the way we need to change the paradigms or perspectives. An example of this we discussed before was Kodak. And because of what was happening on the outside, film was disappearing, and therefore they had to transform their company. And they were quite unsuccessful to do that. They had to declare bankruptcy um, fairly recently, about 10 years ago. We sort of compare that with its competitor, Fujifilm, which is a Japanese company, which was able to transform itself into a company that basically uses digital cameras, and also it went into other businesses in order to survive. There's a wonderful video of this, which I urge you to watch. It's on Moodle. And again, it's about Fujifilm. And it's interesting to note how come they were successful and Kodak was not successful. Okay, so as we said, transformation is triggered from the outside. So things that are happening outside is basically forcing the company to make these dramatic changes. An example of this are what we call industry discontinuities. So um, an example of this is a technological disruption. So in other words, something within technology, a new invention is made, and it basically makes all the old technology quite obsolete, or no longer viable. So a great example of this are pagers. So you may not have seen this during your day, but during my day, we had such a thing as pagers. So what they look like is this. So a little gadget that you carry around with you. And if somebody wants to contact you, they may send you something like an SMS. And your little pager would beep, and then you would know you'd have a message. In fact, in the old days, they didn't even have words coming out of a screen. All it did was basically beep. And if it did beep, it meant that you had to call a number, and the person on the other line would tell you, what was the message being sent to you. The later models had basically a screen with some words coming out. And again, it was quite popular during the days in the I believe the 80s and the 90s. But it died, and the reason why it died was because most mobile phones at the time began to have SMS. So with an SMS, you could send a message to to a person. In fact, mobile phones also became more and more popular, and it basically killed this industry. So it, again, an example of technological discontinuity or technological disruption. Um, there are also what we call product life cycle shifts. So many products go through, of course, a growth phase and basically maturity. But when the market starts to shift, then that product might, in fact, begin to decline. And an example of that would be Coca-Cola, with the public and the world now shifting away from sugary drinks. Basically, Coca-Cola's flagship product, the Coca-Cola regular Coca-Cola, is now on the decline, especially in developed nations. Another example would be newspapers, and then I'll probably go back to that and show you. So, newspapers used to be quite popular, but as times went by, and with the advent of the internet, people had substitutes. So they didn't really need to buy a newspaper. You could read your news for free from websites. So really, this spells the decline of the newspaper industry, which means if you were a newspaper company, you would have to think about, how am I going to transform my company so that it survives? One of our case studies, assigned case studies, is the Daily Bugle, and this is in fact the the story behind that transformation that the company was trying to undergo. Another example again would be film versus digital. Although film still exists, film is on its way down, and very fewer and fewer people are using film, especially for videos and to make movies. Another example of a trigger for transformation is an internal company dynamic. So, an example I have would be Qantas. In the I think 2012, they underwent a very disruptive event. They were having a lot of problems competing with other airlines around the world. Qantas is a private company. It used to be would have some government ownership, but eventually Australian government no longer controls Qantas. It's basically operating on its own. But many other airlines around the world are actually run and basically owned by government, in which case government actually provides money for that company to operate. And people argue, and Qantas will argue, that this is quite unfair because as a private company, they have to fend for themselves. Um, Basically, they became quite pressured because other companies, other airline companies, basically could provide flights that were cheaper, while Qantas, of course, has to basically pay for its high labor costs, and they weren't very competitive. But at the same time, the employees were clamoring for more benefits, better compensation, etc. So they came to a point during their negotiation, and the unions of Qantas were asking for more money. The employees were asking for more money, and Qantas could not provide added benefits because they were competing with other airlines, and the other airlines, of course, had the backing of government, and then basically many of these airlines had cheaper wages, etc. So what Qantas had to do was a very bold move. Was they locked out their union employees? So they basically shut their operations down. This was in the early 2010s. To pressure the union to basically accept the fact that they couldn't provide any more additional wages and benefits. So eventually the government stepped in and basically prevented the workers and prevented the company from shutting down, and operations went back. But that particular very bold move by Qantas actually created a transformation in the culture of Qantas. So much so that their union now has to play ball, and they realize that the company can't just continue to operate and keep providing very high wages, or continuing to increase their benefits at an unsustainable manner. So again, that's an example of internal company dynamics. Although we can argue that part of this is there's an external influence, and that is the competitiveness of other airlines around the world. So a key thing about transformational, creating transformation in organizations is your leaders, or the leaders have to have these elements of what we call transformational leadership. So in order for you to be successful, a leader who's trying to transform an organization needs to have basically these four very important elements. And the first is what we call creating a strategic vision. So when you create a strategic vision, what you're really trying to do is create an image of the company's future. So again, if you were Qantas and you're trying to create this shift, you're trying to create this image. The company is very competitive and is able to compete against global players. And basically, if you create that stunning, or this very compelling future for the company, then it motivates and it bonds employees. So employees have this feeling that they've got a common goal to achieve. And the other thing is, it's the leader that basically creates this vision and basically champions it. So he's the person that um, basically motivates, or he basically creates that vision and communicates that vision. And in fact, that's the next element, would be uh, making sure that vision is understood by the employees around the company. So basically, you frame the message around a very grand purpose for the organization, and you share that mental model of the future using symbols, metaphors, and stories around the organization. So the leaders, or the leader, has to model the vision. In other words, if he's saying the company needs to be very innovative, he has to show himself, he has to show others that he is a very innovative person. So basically, this is what we mean by walk the talk. So whatever you're saying, you actually have to follow it. You have to symbolize and demonstrate the vision through the behavior that you're showing to other people. So when you do that, trust is built. So the employees begin to trust their leader more and more, because they see that their leader actually is following what he is saying and what he's preaching. A third element would be encourage experimentations. In other words, let people try new things, let them learn from their mistakes, and don't be angry when they make mistakes, because that's the way people learn. And the final element is basically building that commitment to the vision. So if we do all of these three elements, actually four elements, including experimentation, we hope to create that commitment to the vision. So again, commitment means that the employees are involved in actually shaping and actually participating in creating that vision and achieving that vision. So an important cultural objective when we are creating transformation is to ensure that the organization is always learning. So it doesn't stop after it's learned something new. It's always looking for something else to learn, and basically it's an acceptance that change is a constant. So in other words, always expect change. So when you create that culture, you're actually learning and innovation begins to occur at all levels of the organization. and it involves all the employees. Continuous learning and testing, testing out different ways of perceiving, thinking, and behaving. So all of this is directed by that vision we talked about. So if we've got the vision that the organization has to achieve a certain goal, has to be, come out with the best products, etc., then that's going to drive the continuous innovation and learning. So to achieve transformational change, you need two very important things. And the first is organization design. So you have to be able to design the organization to create this continuous learning environment. But also you need to change the culture of the organization. So let's talk about this. So organization design is actually realizing that there are interlocking components when we are creating the organization and designing the way it works. And there's a really, really good video, again, in Moodle that explains organization design, and I encourage you to watch it for more information. But in a nutshell, what organization design is saying is that we first begin with a strategy, an overall strategy for the organization. And then we ensure that we design everything else to make sure that it supports that strategy. And that includes structure. So last week we talked about structure, different types of structure, the elements like whether we are centralized or more decentralized. We look at the formality of the organization. All of these are part of organization structure. And what we're saying is if we're designing a structure, it must fit the strategy of the organization. So aside from that, our management in information systems has to support again, the strategy, the HR practices. And also last week, we talked about how we design employees' jobs and their work, whether it's going to be, we're going to improve it by rotation or enrichment or empowerment of the employees. All of that will form basically our design, which again supports the overall strategy of the organization. Okay, so the other element that we talked about is organization culture. And again, culture is important. If we're going to achieve real transformation of the organization, we have to look at the basic assumptions, values, and norms within an organization and basically change that to something that supports the strategy of the organization. So culture is defined as this pattern of shared assumptions and values. So in other words, this is what the employees believe in. This is what they hold to be very important within their lives and the lives within the organization. And this culture helps members make sense of the organization. And it signals how work is to be done and how it's evaluated and how employees also relate to each other. So they say culture is like an iceberg. So imagine that the organizational culture has, and if you notice, by the way, when you put down an ice cube in a glass of water, that there's a portion of that ice cube or piece of ice that is outside of the water that you can see. But below that, in fact, the larger part of the ice cube is underwater. So that represents the things that we don't really see in a culture. So an iceberg is the same thing. You see a tip of a mountain, but there's a huge portion of that underwater. So that is what culture is. And the things that you see are what we call artifacts. These are the physical structures, the rituals and ceremonies, the stories that we've heard about the history of the company. These are all part of what we call the artifacts of a culture, things that you can actually see. But below that, are the more important parts of a culture. And these are the things that you can't really see, but you know it's there. These are the shared values, the shared assumptions, what people believe in. And this is what you really have to aim to try to shape if you're a leader. So this slide, it basically just shows us an example of how we can describe culture. And I urge everyone, when you're doing your case study, try to examine what the current culture is of your the company that's centered in your case study. Are they an innovative company? Or the opposite of being innovative is a company that believes in stability. So they're not really companies that are value stability means that they don't really change that often. They like the fact that things are predictable. They're very rule oriented, very formal perhaps, and they expect people to follow certain rules. So you can see that these are descriptive words, and one can be basically opposite the other. So I doubt very much if you're a company that's very innovative, then largely you probably don't really value stability. On the other hand, if you're a company that values stability, then you probably won't be as innovative. So another description would be respect for people. So organizations that have a very strong respect for people, you'll see that they're very good with their employees. They offer a lot of benefits that maybe other companies don't. For example, some companies allow working from home even in a non-virus situation, while some companies perhaps insist that their employees come to work, and they may be more focused on outcomes and results as opposed to uh, taking care of their employees or making sure employees uh, are well looked after. The opposite of that might be an outcome orientation. So a company that's very action oriented, very profit oriented, that could be what we call an outcome orientation. And in many cases, this outcome orientation or task orientation will be quite opposite to a company that has more respect for people or perhaps are more people oriented. Um, Another example might be a company might have strong attention to detail, very precise, very analytical, while another might be more team oriented. Some companies are aggressive, very competitive. They don't really emphasize social responsibility, for example, while some companies are like very cautious. So it's almost like a personality. So certain people are more innovative than others. Certain people are more aggressive, while some are more cautious. So a personality is basically like, a culture is basically like a person's personality, but then we're describing the entire organization's personality. So again, if you were a company and you wanted to be more successful, then you have to think about whether these values are correct or are they suited for the goal that you want to do. And if you feel that there's a lack of innovation in your company, then and you want to establish a more innovative culture, then you need to sort of as a leader, you need to put in steps to try to move this culture from one of being stable to being very innovative. So again, I remind everyone to look at their case studies and see whether if you describe the existing culture and you want to change that culture, you need to be clear as to what kind of a culture you want to create. And these are some dimensions that you could sort of use to describe where you want to take the organization. Okay, so that's it. Uh, Next session will be a midterm. So I'm hoping that everybody does attend the midterm revision. And yeah, I'll see you next time.